You're listening to Navigating the French on Paris Underground Radio. For more great content and a bonus episode of Navigating the French, please join us on Patreon.
Hello, and welcome to Navigating the French, the podcast where each episode we take a look at a French word and try and see what it tells us about French culture. I'm your host, Emily Monaco. Today, I'm joined by Antonia Wimbush, a researcher whose work delves into French-Caribbean migration in literature. She's here to explore a word that is often translated as stranger or foreigner, but that, due to the universalism so sought after by French culture, is actually way more complex to parse. Étranger. Welcome, Dr. Antonia Wimbush, to the podcast. Thank you so very much for joining me today. For our listeners, could you give us a little bit of an insight into sort of your background, what you've done your research in, and where you're working today?
Hi, Emily. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really looking forward to talking to you today. So I'm currently a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Liverpool, and my research investigates cultural responses to post-war migration from the French Caribbean islands of Martinique and Guadeloupe to mainland France. I'm looking specifically at the Bumidome, which was a state-organised migration bureau, and how that has been represented and memorialised in French and Caribbean culture. So perhaps we can talk more about that later on. But from July 2023, I will actually be moving to the University of Melbourne, where I'll be working as a lecturer in global French studies. So this will be a big change, but one I'm really excited about.
That is a really exciting change. I'm so interested to hear a little bit more about kind of what brought you to this specific research topic. Has it always been something that's interested you over the course of your career, or was it something that sort of came to you later on?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I completed my PhD at the University of Birmingham between 2014 and 2018. And my PhD examined themes of exile and migration in Francophone women's autobiographical writing. So I looked at a wide range of texts from across the French-speaking world, including from the Caribbean, but not only from the Caribbean. So I also looked at texts from Algeria, from the Ivory Coast, from Vietnam, and so on. And this was a really interesting project, which led me to think in more detail about themes of exile and migration. And it was during my PhD, I was looking at a text by Guadeloupean writer Gisèle Pineau, and it was her autobiographical text, L'exil selon Julia. And this is a text which talks about her childhood growing up in Paris in the early 1960s. And she describes how she experienced loneliness and alienation as a young Black child living in France, in the banlieue in Paris. And I was reading this text and I came across the term Bumidome, and I'd never heard of the term Bumidome before. I didn't know what it was. And so I asked my PhD supervisor at the time if she could explain what it was for me. And she said, there you go, there's another research project for you. Go and find out what the Bumidome was. So that's really kind of how my interest in the Bumidome and this instance of state-organised migration from the Caribbean to mainland France in the 1950s and 60s, it really was kind of stemming from my PhD and my interest in exile and migration.
Wow. And this is such an interesting lens through which to explore this word that is, it's fascinating to me as someone interested in linguistics because it is often sort of construed as a false friend, which is étranger. It has that word étrange in it, which we think of as being strange. Étranger, I think the first time a lot of foreign language learners who are first encountering French find this word is in, of course, Albert Camus' L'Étranger. And the translation of that title is often the stranger. I'm going to withhold my own thoughts on this for just a second. How do you feel about that translation in the context of the novel and the time in which it was published?
Yeah, that's a great question. And as you say, it's a really great entry point into this notion of l'étranger and how we can translate this term into English. It's a politically loaded term in French, but equally, I would say it's also a politically loaded term in English, how we translate this. So coming back to the idea of Camus' novel L'étranger, so this was a novel which was published in French in 1942, and it's been translated numerous times, I think 5 times now into English. And the most recent translation was quite recently in 2013. So it is a text that's been translated and retranslated numerous times. And it's really interesting because I think British publications have actually tended to favour the title The Outsider, whereas US versions of these translations have often preferred the title The Stranger. So we can see there's kind of cultural differences perhaps in how this title has been translated. But as I was thinking about this, I've come across a book by Alice Kaplan, which was published in 2016 and entitled Looking for the Stranger, Albert Camus and the Life of a Literary Classic. And this book is really a biography not of Camus himself as an author, but the biography of the text and how the text has been translated and retranslated and reworked. And Alice Catpen talks about the history of these two different titles, the fact that the English version, the British version, tend to favour the outsider, whereas the US versions have preferred the stranger. And she explains that there's a historical reason for this. So the translation rights to the texts were bought in 1945, and they were shared between a British and American publisher. So the British publisher Knopf and the American publisher Jamie Hamilton. And the text was translated by Stuart Gilbert. And in September 1945, he sent the manuscript to both the British and the American publishers. And he chose the title The Stranger. But in January 1946, Hamilton, so the American publisher, sent the British publisher a bound and typeset version of the translation, and the title had actually been changed to The Outsider. And he explained that he thought that The Outsider was more striking and more appropriate, but also that a British publisher had also published a text with the same title, The Stranger. So you can see there the rivalry between British and American publishers, which I think explains why we have these differences in translations and why there is this difference between the British and American publisher. And it's really interesting because I think both The Outsider and The Stranger have different connotations and they can be used to mean different things. Perhaps The Outsider might work better in this particular context because the narrator Meursault in the novel, he's not actually a foreigner. So he's a French man living in colonial Algiers. So perhaps his strangeness is one of alienation. It's not necessarily one of foreignness. But you could argue, and some critics have argued, that using the term the outsider actually erases the political connotations of the term étranger in French, which does connote this idea of being different in terms of nationality, as well as being different in terms of feeling alienated or feeling different as well. So perhaps using that particular title doesn't actually convey the whole political connotation of these two terms. But I'd be really interested to hear your thoughts about which you think perhaps works better.
Yeah, well, absolutely. I mean, I love that you've also started to talk about this idea of foreigner, because I feel like now after, I've been in France for 15 years now, I speak French, and I feel like when I hear the word étranger, the instinctual connotation that I sort of intuit is one of foreignness, and specifically one of a foreign nationality. And you've hit the nail on the head right there with l'étranger. And I'm thinking this is going to be something that also kind of folds into your work as well. This sense of one element of identity that we've spoken about before on the podcast for anyone who's listened to the episode on d'origine or origine is that in France, the idea of citizenship and foreign roots are kind of separated in a way that they aren't quite so much in American culture. And maybe British culture seems to strike me, although I'm not British, as kind of being halfway in between the two, where you do still tap into the origins of your roots, but maybe in less of a hoist the flag kind of way that we do in America. But in France, there is like an erasure of this of any sort of foreign allegiance in your roots, which has problems when it comes to actually having conversations about race and origin. So I assume that in your work, you've kind of seen that the downsides of the kind of eliding of those strict boundaries between, foreignness and actually having origins elsewhere, whether you're foreign or not. So to me, all that to say, I think that the translation of The Stranger doesn't feel quite right. And I think the British translation actually feels truer to the word étranger. But I think that we're still missing a piece. And that's why I think I'm so excited to sort of delve even deeper into what context.
Absolutely. Yes, I completely agree because, the idea of the outsider or the stranger, it still doesn't quite get across this notion of being foreign in terms of being a foreign national, as you were saying. So there's still some kind of slippage there that's not quite captured by that particular phrase. Yes, I agree.
Exactly. And I think that seeing as Camus, as you were saying, is a French national living in Algiers, I wonder in what way, I don't want to obviously oversimplify things, but I wonder in what way we can talk about migration, immigration, ideas of foreignness, and also of nationality when we're talking about this project that you're working on and French Caribbean migration and that sense of foreignness, whether it's about just feeling othered or whether it's an actual political immigration. sort of where do you think it's important that we start approaching those questions of migration and the socio-political frontiers that one must cross in culture and also in the legality of it?
Yeah, I think thinking about the legality of these different terms and really being as specific as we can about defining what these terms actually mean in legal terms, I think that's one of the places where we can start. And I think étranger is a really good example of that. So étranger can mean various different things. It has various different translations. So étranger, as you said, can be feeling other. So it can be kind of feeling alienated and not belonging in particular society. It also has been translated as foreign in the sense of living in a foreign country. And there are certainly, as you said, there are certainly negative connotations of that in both English and French, in the sense of how we actually know, how we can tell from someone's physical appearance whether somebody is foreign or not. In terms of the legality of the situation in French, so I think problems also arise when the term étranger is often allied with the term immigré, in the sense of being a foreigner or being an immigrant. So in legal terms, étranger refers to anybody who is living in France who does not currently hold French nationality, whereas immigré refers to somebody who was born outside of France but who's come to France to live in France for a year or for more, whether they hold French nationality or not. So an immigré can be an étranger because it can mean somebody who's living in France who doesn't hold French nationality, but that's not necessarily the case. And an étranger can be an immigré because it can refer to somebody who's moved to France, but again, it's not necessarily the case. So an immigré can legally be French because it's somebody who can acquire French nationality later on, but a person who is an immigré in France always legally remains an immigré because it refers to that actual fact of moving. Whereas an étranger is not somebody who's legally French because it refers to somebody who hasn't actually got French nationality. And the status of étranger can actually change. So once you have French nationality, you are then legally speaking no longer an étranger. So I think this is one of the really important things, is to get these distinctions really accurate so that people understand exactly what these terms refer to, and so that they're not conflated, and then that value judgments aren't necessarily given to them, because we do tend to have these value judgments in France and in the UK and elsewhere as well about what an étranger and what an immigré actually refers to.
And I think I would add to that as well that as someone who's been naturalized as a French citizen, I still definitely, even though my legal status is no longer that of étrangère, and I say this speaking as somebody who speaks French and is white, and I'm aware of the fact that those are two elements of privilege that I hold in this sort of arena, I definitely still feel that sort of d'origine étrangère piece of the identity puzzle here. And that's something that I assume that it becomes even more of a gray area when, as you were saying, there are sort of these outward signs. You know, if we're talking about race, if we're talking about a lack of familiarity with the language, or, you know, remains of an accent, of a foreign accent, those are pieces of the puzzle that are going to have implicit repercussions on the way that someone feels ensconced in French society or not, as the case may be.
Absolutely. I agree 100%. So I was talking just now about the legality of the situation in terms of what étranger and immigré means, but in terms of actually fitting into society and how other people react to you as a white woman living in France in your case, or whether somebody who is of colour who doesn't necessarily speak French, obviously that's going to be very different. But yes, absolutely, in terms of the positionality and how you yourself and how other people actually feel as though they fit in or not, and how they're treated in French society because of their particular status, obviously that's very different.
If you're enjoying this episode of Navigating the French, you may also be interested in our sister podcast, Storytime in Paris, where each week host Jennifer interviews a different author about his or her book set in Paris or France. Navigating the French will be right back after a word from our sponsors. And now, back to Navigating the French. And then when it comes, of course, to your research, when we're talking about the French Caribbean, we obviously have some migrations that are going to require more legal acrobatics than others because, of course, some residents of the French Caribbean are already French citizens. So for those who are not familiar with sort of the different overseas French territories and departments, could you, I know it's probably more complex than I'm going to give you the time to talk about it, but in sort of layman's Cliff Notes terms, could you offer a little bit of clarity for those who are not familiar with those resident and departments?
Yes, absolutely. So So my research focuses on Martinique and Guadeloupe, so the two islands in the Caribbean. And Martinique and Guadeloupe are both part of France. So they're what's called overseas departments, or départements et régions d'outre-mer. So they became departments through the departmentalization law of 1947. So before 1947, they were part of the French Empire. They were colonies. But the departmentalization law of 1947 meant that they became French departments. So like any of the departments in mainland France, whether that's Île-de-France, whether that's departments in the south of France, they are departments. They are part of France, which means that people living in Martinique and Guadeloupe have the right to live and work in any department of France. So their migration from the Caribbean to Europe, to continental France, is really a kind of an internal migration. It's really a movement from one part of France to another, just like it would be if somebody from Paris decided to move to Marseille, for instance. So that we really do need to kind of consider that particular historical context, the fact that these people have the right to move, and they had citizenship really since 1848, which was when slavery was abolished in the French colonies. So they are citizens of France. They have long been citizens of France, and therefore that means that they do have the right to move within the boundaries of France. That doesn't mean, and we've seen this historically, that doesn't mean that they have always been welcomed in France. It doesn't mean that their migration is not problematic. It certainly has been for particular individuals and communities. But in legal terms, they have the right to move because Martinique and Guadeloupe, as well as Réunion in the Indian Ocean, and also French Guiana. So they're the other two departments, départements d'outre-mer, or overseas departments of France.
Okay. So obviously, yes, as you said, there's no legal issue to them relocating to anywhere in mainland France, or what we'd call the hexagon in l'hexagone in French. But you mentioned that there are some sort of maybe some social issues with it. Do you get the impression that the issues to these sort of waves of migration has anything to do with a perceived foreignness, a perception of them as being, of these people as being étranger in any way, or is it something else?
Absolutely. I think it is that's exactly why they are treated as they are étranger, because primarily because of their physical appearance. They look as if they are not belonging to France, as in a white kind of hegemonic version of France and what we understand French people to be. And because in the French imaginary, to be a French citizen has always been to be a white French citizen. And so this really clashes with the idea of these people from Martinique and Guadeloupe and the other departments that I've mentioned being French, because they don't look as if they are traditionally French in the traditional understanding of what to be French means. So I think absolutely the fact that they are treated as they are foreign and that they do not hold French nationality, even though they are French citizens, and therefore they don't need a visa or they don't need any other legal permissions to work and live in l'Hexagone, but they are treated as though that they do, and they're treated as though they are étranger.
And do you think, I'm wondering if this is purely a question of race and outward appearance, or if there's another sort of cultural ramification. And to that end, I'm wondering if we imagine a born and raised Parisian who is Black versus a born and raised Martiniquais who is Black, do you get the sense that one or the other would be more easily accepted by most people living in l'Hexagone or not?
I think, as you said, there are certainly other factors to consider, and cultural factors certainly do play a big part in this. Also, linguistic factors. The way that French is spoken in Martinique and Guadeloupe is different to the ways that French is spoken in l'Hexagone. There's a different accent, there's different intonations. The Creole or Creole, Guadeloupean and Martinican Creole, the language that's kind of the primary language of Martinicans and Guadeloupeans, certainly of a particular generation, certainly plays a part in this sense that people are different and are foreign. So racism isn't the only element. I would say that there are cultural elements as well. But it's also often true that people living in Paris or living in other large cities in mainland France are often treated as though they have these connections to the diaspora, to the Caribbean. Even if they may have been born in France, they may not necessarily feel that connection. They may go and visit Martinique every 3 years, for instance, to see family, but they may not necessarily feel an affinity with this particular cultural context. But often they are stereotyped, they're discriminated against, and people think that they necessarily have that particular identity, even if they do not feel it because they have been born and raised in France. So it's a really difficult thing to actually pinpoint in terms of how people react to these different people.
And one thing that kind of brings me back again to this question of otherness or strangeness is, if we are sort of imagining that your lambda French person looks at people coming from the dom-tom as being other or foreign or étranger, it kind of leads us to intuit that there is this imagined French person to whom everyone is being compared, and that is what is othering those other people. So, as you said, the use of a different accent or of a Creole, a different race. So if we imagine we have this false desire for universalism in France and this false desire to sort of erase many of our differences to put everyone on an equal footing. But at the end of the day, do we have to sort of assume that even without overtly thinking so, most French people would imagine a classic French person as being white and male and speaking standard French and coming from, the hexagon? Or am I oversimplifying an issue of, race and linguistics and geography that's far more complex when we're thinking about foreign versus not foreign?
I think that certainly has been the case. And that was very much the colonial way of thinking, that to be French was to be a white male speaking a standard version of French. And that was the French culture that was circulated across the French Empire. And that was the reason of creating the French Empire, was to circulate that notion of the French culture being superior and the French culture being represented by that particular demographic. So I think that has certainly historically, that has been the case, that in the French imaginary, to be French equals to be white, to be male, to be of a particular social class. And yes, we can see that people are challenging these definitions and these notions of what it means to be French. And that's certainly been done in academic work, but also in French activism, in literature, in culture, and so on. Really trying to get away from this notion of what it means to be French, and to think about that there are lots of other ways of being French and that are equally valid. And that's really what people are trying to get at in their work.
And so when you're looking at French Caribbean migration in literature, and you're looking at these voices that are actually experiencing the migration and arriving in mainland France and sort of navigating these differences and navigating being perceived as étranger, but also maybe navigating cultural specificity that is to them étranger, that is different or other to their experience. How do you perceive that sort of identity? Is that an identity crisis that people are sort of displaying in literature? What do you sort of see as their lens of describing that experience in broader strokes?
So just to give a very brief kind of overview of the research project. So the project is looking at the Bumidum, which, as I mentioned earlier, was this state-organized migration bureau. So it was set up in 1963. And the idea was to effectively move people from the Caribbean, also from Réunion as well in the Indian Ocean, to mainland France. There was a very high level of unemployment and very high birth rates on the islands, whereas in mainland France, there was a need of a workforce to rebuild France after the Second World War. There was also dire economic circumstances on the island, so people were very poor in general terms. And so the idea was to create this bureau to try to regulate the economy and also regulate the population. So people had to apply for financial support to be able to migrate to mainland France. And they were then promised that they would be found work in the civil service and in public service sectors such as transportation. But what often happened was that they were found very low paid jobs. Women in particular were targeted, and they were given domestic jobs as domestic maids or as cleaners and healthcare workers in hospitals. And it was often very difficult for them to find housing, and they were subjected to racial discrimination when they were trying to find housing. So that's the context in which my research is really focusing on. It's focusing on the 1960s to 80s. And I'm looking at how literature and film has represented that particular migratory trajectory, both at the time, so both in the 1960s and 70s primarily, when this migration was actually occurring, and also today, and thinking about if there are any differences in those particular representations. And the majority of the cultural representations that I've looked at do look at the Bumidum particularly and migration more generally in quite negative terms. So they're quite critical of the Bumidum, and they're thinking about how this was a means of discriminating against these particular communities and a way of controlling them, and the fact that it was very much they were promised these very high paid jobs, but actually this didn't actually occur. Also, a lot of the texts talk about return, so the fact of people wanting to return to the Caribbean, but perhaps were not able to because they were not able to have enough money. And it's only really been since people have retired that they've been able to return to Martinique and Guadeloupe in particular. So, and yes, and they talk about this idea of feeling étranger. So even though they are French and they were French when they migrated, they felt as though they were treated as étranger. So primarily, I would say it's quite a negative depiction that I've found so far in the texts that I've looked at, of feeling that they did not fit in to mainland France, whether that's because of their colour, also because of linguistic differences, also because of cultural differences as well.
And are those artists, writers, filmmakers, generally, so far what you've looked at, basically, are the people creating the art the people who are being depicted in the art, or is this art being created by a white French person from the Hexagon?
So they're people who have been involved or they've been affected by this particular migratory trajectory. So I've looked at autobiographical writing by people who did actually migrate in the 1960s and 70s. So of course they talk about their own experiences. The novels that I've looked at, so for example, Fabienne Canor, I don't know if you're familiar with her work. She lives in France. She was born in France, in mainland France, but she's of Martinican origin. And her parents came over in the 1960s and 70s. So it's kind of the next generation. But it's people who have been affected by this particular trajectory who are from the French Caribbean that I'm looking at. And that's what I found, rather than people in white French, people from mainland France writing about this particular migratory trajectory. When I've spoken to people in France, it's not something that they're particularly aware of. People who are in mainland France today, people I've spoken to in Guadeloupe and Martinique, again, it's not something that's particularly taught in schools. It's not really spoken about. It's something that's kind of really, the memory of this has been silenced. And I think particularly because of the stigma that was attached to people migrating through the Bermuda, because effectively it meant that these people did not have the financial resources to be able to move themselves because, as I said, they had the legal right to move. It was the fact that they didn't have the financial resources to be able to do so. And so there's kind of been a stigma attached to people who had to rely on state support in order to migrate from the Caribbean to mainland France.
Okay. And that is, I mean, I think a really essential element then is that they had this right, whereas, other migration narratives will probably spend a lot of time navigating sort of the legal ramifications of moving, whereas this particular subset of people had the full right to do so, but it was mostly a financial boundary. And then this ensuing cultural boundary. Absolutely,
yes. So there's a real difference in what they had to negotiate. As you said, they didn't have to negotiate the legality of migration and visas and work permits and so on, whereas other groups obviously do have that to consider. This is a very different kind of migration, and it's really kind of, as I said, an internal migration. But the sense of being étranger and feeling étranger still holds up, I would argue.
No, absolutely. And I almost feel as though when you discover the stories of other migrations where there is a legal border crossing and there is that sort of adoption of a new culture and a new language, but you almost feel as though, of course, there's a cultural hurdle to climb. Of course, there's a linguistic barrier to climb because there has been a true immigration, whereas perhaps this internal migration is a little more fraught because on paper, there shouldn't be this sense of étranger, except that there is.
Absolutely. So perhaps it makes their sense of feeling étranger, the fact that there shouldn't be those kinds of boundaries and barriers there, because as we've said, they are legally French. They are French citizens. So yes, absolutely.
If you're enjoying this episode of Navigating the French, you may also be interested in our sister podcast, Romancing in Paris, which delves into love, lust, and so much more in the City of Light. Navigating the French will be right back after a word from our sponsors. And now, back to Navigating the French. Obviously, this period that you're looking at is firmly in the past at this point, but there is still movement within France, between France and the French Caribbean and within France. Do you get the sense that those boundaries are softening in any way, that people who would be making that move now, or people who are here now after their parents or grandparents, I guess at this point, had made that move? Do you get the sense that their sense of feeling foreign or othered is dissolving in any way in sort of a more modern French cultural context, or not really?
I think yes. I think there is certainly more of a sense of kind of these boundaries being more fluid and people moving constantly between the French Caribbean and mainland France. And I think this was really evident in the pandemic when we were in Le Confinement, and with this constant travel between the French Caribbean and mainland France obviously couldn't happen because the borders were closed. So even though Martinique and Guadeloupe are French, they weren't able to move across the Atlantic. So, and I think that really kind of shows the permeability of these boundaries and the fact that people are moving constantly all the time. Whether for work, whether for study, whether for personal reasons as well. So, and I think that that kind of movement and fluidity has become more accepted in French society today. So I think absolutely there is that kind of progress in that sense. I think it's only a different demographic of people who are moving. In the period that I'm looking at for my research, it was primarily a working class population. It was primarily people who were working as domestics or in the transportation sector or in the healthcare sector, whereas today it's people who are primarily professionals, it's students who are moving, it's people who have a higher quality of living and high standard of living in general. So I think the demographic of people who are moving has changed, and whether that has an influence on the ways in which their étrangeté is manifested and experienced is perhaps interesting to consider.
And that the issue of the confinement is a really interesting one to look at as well, because it does sort of show more clearly the financial constraints of it being a working class migration versus a middle class migration or even an upper middle class migration. I'm thinking specifically, during lockdown, people who mostly lived in urban centers would have been able to go to their second home in, the Loire or Normandy or in the South if they were so lucky as to have a second home. The fact that you couldn't get on a plane and go to Guadeloupe is one piece of the puzzle, but it also, we also need to remember that some people didn't have anywhere else that they could go. I think I'm not saying this quite as clearly as I'd like to, but there was an issue during lockdown of everybody feeling quite frozen to where they were, and it revealed that obviously what a lot of people already knew quite deeply, but that I think France likes to sort of sweep under the rug, culturally speaking, which is that if you have more money, you can obviously move far more easily than if you don't have more money. And that means if you can go a couple of kilometers or overseas.
Absolutely. And yeah, financial privilege, the social class certainly had a huge impact on the ways in which COVID was experienced, not only in the numbers of people who actually contracted COVID and also died from COVID. So there's been a lot of studies, certainly in the UK, about Black populations being affected much more seriously by COVID because they were the ones who were working in the healthcare service and were actually having to actually be physically in work, as opposed to people who could work from home in other professions. And absolutely, as you said, people with more financial privilege are able to move much more easily. They have much more possibilities of being able to get out of the cities, to get out of that particular environment and move somewhere where they will be much safer in terms of their healthcare. So absolutely.
That was a bit of a tangent, but I think it might have been an important one for us to linger on. To sort of bring things back, though, to this sense of feeling foreign, do you get the sense that, and I know this isn't necessarily the focus of your research, but do you get the sense that today there is any sort of wide-scale, established, organized movement to revendiquer or, lay claim to a more concrete recognition of citizenship or of non-étranger status of these people whose origins are in Martinique, Guadeloupe, or other overseas departments in France? Is that something that people are pushing for, or is it just something that's sort of slowly evolving without a wide movement in favor of that recognition?
I think it is something that's being pushed for, whether through activism in France or whether through artistic movement as well. Quite recently, there's been quite a lot of documentaries shown on French television about what it's like to be a Black French citizen today and what that means to be Black and living in France. So I think it was in November 2022, the Noir en France documentary. I don't know if you saw that.
Yes.
Which was really interesting because it was narrated by the writer Alain Mabankou, and also featuring quite high profile other Black figures. So obviously you have kind of the social class and the privilege element there. But I think it's really important that these documentaries are being produced, and French television is starting to talk about this in the French media. So that's kind of perhaps been reflecting what's going on in grassroots movements and on the ground, in the sense that people are trying to lay claim to their citizenship and trying to really call into question what being a French citizen actually means, and the fact of trying to kind of contest this notion that Frenchness equals whiteness, and really trying to figure that out. So I think perhaps particularly in artistic work and also in activism as well, that these debates are being held in France today. It's
very interesting to draw parallels between the sort of race reckoning that we're seeing in the United States versus the race reckoning that we're seeing in France, because obviously they're rooted in such different backgrounds. Do you get the sense that there are, without ironing things too much as to reduce the complexity of these issues, which are obviously very complex, do you get the sense that there is sort of a different mindset given the completely different histories of the two countries? And obviously I recognize that you're not from the United States, so maybe the question is not the right one. But because we have these two very loud, proud, very prominent race reckonings right now, do you get the sense that because of the different historical contexts, people are formulating their messaging in different ways?
That's a great question. I think in France, it's still the case, obviously, in the French Constitution, that race isn't a kind of an identity category. So to be French, you are a French citizen. First and foremost, you are French. And the French Constitution doesn't actually distinguish in terms of race. And I think that is potentially kind of hindering this, certainly institutional reckoning with race and identity, because, for instance, statistics aren't counted in terms of the different racial categories in France. So I think that's in terms of the legality of the situation, it's very different in the sense that race isn't recognised in France in the same way as it might be in other particular contexts. So I think until France can really grapple with what race is and how it does actually affect experiences and everyday lived experiences of living in France, I think that it's still very difficult to reckon with that, and certainly institutionally. So I think that is perhaps one of the key differences, really, this idea of kind of Republican universalism, that everybody is equal in France. France doesn't recognise race as a particular category.
Yeah, that's so essential, because at the end of the day, if you are a Black French citizen from Martinique, on paper, there is nothing that sort of validates any feeling you might feel of being othered, because on paper, your race is not indicated. You are a French citizen. So if you feel as though you're being othered by society, it's almost like that sounds like a you problem. And obviously it's not.
Exactly. Yeah. So this kind of non-recognition of this particular status plays a huge part in that, I think, definitely.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Well, thank you so very much for joining me on the podcast today. This has been an illuminating conversation, and I look forward to sharing this with our listeners, as well as sharing any of your work that is available for anyone who wants to read a bit more about what you've been up to, what you've been working on. Are you on social media? Have you published any books that we can link in our show notes? Anything that would allow our listeners to learn a little bit more about your research?
Absolutely. First of all, thank you so much for having me. This has been a great conversation. So I'm on Twitter. Twitter handle is at Wimbush_Antonia. And my first book, which is titled Autofiction, A Female Francophone Aesthetic of Exile, was published in 2021. So that's already out. And I have a second book, which has been contracted with Edinburgh University Press. So that's the one that I'm currently working on at the moment. And that's the Bumidum project. So a lot of this detail will be in the book that I'm working on at the moment.
Amazing. Well, we'll keep an eye out for that one. And I will put links to your first book and to your Twitter in our show notes.
Excellent.
Thank you again so much for joining us. Congratulations on the new job. And I look forward to hearing more great things from you moving forward.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
This has been Navigating the French. You can find more from me, Emily Monaco, at Emily_in_France on Twitter and Instagram. This podcast is produced by Paris Underground Radio. To listen to other episodes of this podcast, or to discover more podcasts like it, please visit parisundergroundradio.com. Thanks for listening, and à bientôt.
This episode of Navigating the French was produced by Jennifer Garrity for Paris Underground Radio. For more great content, join us on Patreon at patreon.com/Paris Underground Radio.